This is Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. The Washington Midsummer Renaissance Faire is the largest Ren Fair in the state. It'll bring out fairies, pirates, knights in shining armor, and more for 5 weeks starting in mid-July near the Skykomish River outside of Monroe. It has a whole lot of fans, including one of our colleagues at KUOW, Vicky VanHout. She says Ren Fairs are all about dressing up in medieval garb, dancing to medieval-themed music, archery, axe throwing. It's a celebration of cosplay and history altogether.
I'm a huge fan of things like The Lord of the Rings. I like dressing for the part. I like engaging in a community who is all really engaged and out to teach and hang out and have a really good time and drink and laugh and sing and dance and all that. Huge fan of all of that together.
But not everybody is happy with the state of the fair. They say something's amiss. And it's not the pirates hitting the grog too hard or Mistress Tiddlywinks' donkey breaking into the cabbage patch again. The Village of Merriwick, a.k.a. the fictional home of the Washington Midsummer Renaissance Faire, is at the center of a new investigative report in the summer edition of Seattle Met. The story details a series of allegations about management's treatment of volunteer staff and questions about their financial priorities, as well as bigger questions about the changes that some argue are sacrificing the soul of the fair. Natalie Graham is a staff writer at The Stranger and freelancer with Seattle Met, and she spent months researching this story. Natalie, thank you so much for being here. I encourage everybody, by the way, to go read the story in Seattle Met because it has great photos. Really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here and to spill the piping hot mead, maybe.
That's great. We're going to do this all in character, the full time. So how did you first get involved with the story? Because I hear that there's kind of an interesting series of events that brought you to reporting on the Ren Fair.
Yeah, so I know I had to dust the cobwebs off my memory. No, so it started maybe 2 years ago. I was a freelancer full time, and I had freelance written this column for The Stranger. I still am writing it, so you can check that out too, called Playdate, where I try out subcultures and hobbies in Seattle and I write about them. And I was trying to think of a way to do a twist on that and to write for a different outlet. So I pitched the Seattle Met. I'd never been to a Ren Fair. I wanted to know what it was like inside the place where, the tavern where they're serving beer. So I pitched the Seattle Met about shadowing the bar maidens at the Washington Midsummer Renaissance Faire. So I reached out to the Ren Fair and they were kind of game. And I was like, okay, cool. We're cooking. We can maybe do this story. And then they stopped responding. I'd already pitched the Met. I had to reach back out to my editor, Eric Nussbaum, over there and tell him that the story was pretty much dead. And he was like, okay, well, maybe we can do something on this later. Lo and behold, about a couple weeks go by and there's this tell-all bombshell Reddit post about how the Washington Midsummer Renaissance Faire is terrible. It's mistreating its staff. It's mistreating its volunteers, which is what most of its workers are. And so Eric at the Seattle Met sent me that and said, hey, do you think there's something here for a story? And I said, yes.
So chuck the barmaid shadowing puff piece and maybe do some reporting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, he basically was like, let's look into this. And yeah, it was a complete gear shift. And so I started looking into it. And in November, Eric reaches back out and says, hey, do you think we can finally write that Ren Fair piece? And I said, sure. And he gave me a 6-month deadline, which to me at the point was unheard of.
That's a dream.
Yeah. So I had some time to dig into it.
So how do these things operate? What is the structure of the Washington Midsummer Renaissance Faire? And you have mentioned this already, but a lot of this runs on volunteers, right? So first off, how's this structured? And then who are the people who are actually doing the work?
Such a good question. It took me talking to multiple guild workers to figure out the answer. In short, it seems to be a confusing structure, but I will spell it out. So the Washington Midsummer Renaissance Faire, as it stands right now, is a nonprofit. It has been for 15 years, and there's a board, and then they have a handful of full-time paid staff employees. But the bulk of the people you see on the ground at the Ren Fair, the character actors, the experiences, the jousters, those types of people, they are guild workers. And guilds are pretty much, they were described to me as little community theater groups, but they pretty much function as unions, kind of. And the fair will give these guilds a stipend for the weekend or for the entire run of the fair. But historically, the stipend has been pennies. They've given a guild of maybe, 15 people $300 for the weekend. So nobody's living off of this money. And in recent years, after guild members have kind of organized to get better pay as more money is coming in to the Renaissance Fair, as it's getting more popular, they have gotten a standardized wage. And that's a good thing, but it has brought down some of the other... Well, one of the other things I should mention is that, so not only were guilds getting paid not very well, but there was no uniform payment. So different guilds would get maybe a decent amount of money, and then some guilds would get nothing, really.
So a guild that does like sword fighting gets a certain amount, a couple $1,000s maybe, and a guild that plays D&D maybe gets a few hundred. Like there's different amounts.
Right, right. And they kind of don't talk about it either. So there was no uniform payment. That only changed because guild workers had to fight for it.
So the guilds are really the lifeblood of the Renaissance Fair. Like they are the people putting on these performances, or many of the people putting on the performances. They're the folks who are creating the ambiance of a lot of what the visitors experience at the Renaissance Fair. But you write that a lot of the guilds have been leaving the fair in recent years. And folks that you talk to say that it's connected to feelings that management has lost its way in certain ways. What are some of the top concerns? And, this is a really long story. I encourage, again, that folks who are interested can find it at the Seattle Met website. It seems these concerns fall into two different buckets, which is one, treatment of staff, and the other is financial choices. Let's start with treatment of staff. What are the main concerns you heard regarding that?
One of the main complaints is that as the fair has earned more money and has expanded weekends. It used to only be 3 weekends. Now, for the last 2 years, it's been 5 weekends. So that means more work for these guild workers and more money for management. So as the fair has grown and changed, the guild workers are getting fewer perks. So originally they would get free passes for themselves, free passes for friends and family. They got free lunch, things like that. And now they'll only get passes for Sundays, which are kind of the weakest days. There won't be free lunch. And there's just sort of this feeling that the fair, as they say, doesn't really care about them anymore. So there's that kind of hollowing of what once was. And then there are specific incidents. So, for instance, the fair allegedly wouldn't allow one of its workers who was undergoing chemotherapy to run an air conditioner at night in the volunteer camping ground. Allegedly, the fair organizers screamed at people. And there's also a fear of retaliation from these people. So there's actually a clause within Wandering in Time Productions is the for-profit arm that co-runs this fair with the nonprofit, the Washington Renaissance Arts and Education Society. And in the Wandering in Time Productions contract, there's an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, which people who pay attention to the law will know is now illegal as of 2022 in Washington state. And yet these contracts I saw were from 2024. But within the NDA, there's a clause that says that fair workers can be fired for speaking ill of the fair. And I talked to people who were actually fired for this. Like they complained that they were being mistreated, and maybe they posted on Facebook. Maybe they just complained to a manager and they were fired for that.
Okay, so those are some of the allegations detailed in your reporting about concerns that volunteers have had about their treatment by management. What about the financial decisions that those volunteers have questioned? What were the concerns there?
This is where things get interesting. So the Washington Midsummer Renaissance Faire is run by a nonprofit and has been for over a decade. And that is the Washington Renaissance Arts and Education Society. So Ray has had a net revenue of almost $2 million over the last 3 years. And when you dive into these financials, you'll see that the two people in charge of the fair earn 6-figure salaries. And at least last year, they paid themselves a $300,000 consulting fee. So there's a lot of money at play in this nonprofit. And to complicate things, these people also run a for-profit that started in 2018, and that's Wandering in Time Productions. We have no insight into what financials Wandering in Time is making. So when you juxtapose the six-figure plus amount of money that these two people who are running the fair are making and how little the fair workers are earning, and yet they are the fair, it's just very stark.
So you reached out to the folks in charge of the fair because this is a number of allegations about their choices and the way they're running things. This is, again, the nonprofit Washington Renaissance Arts and Education Society, or RAES, and then their for-profit side, which is called Wandering in Time Productions. What did they say in response to the allegations and the story?
They issued a blanket statement about how rising costs have impacted ticket prices and they've resulted in a more selective vendor process. They said that they respond quickly to concerns about anyone who's acted out of line with their community values. But they're really excited to welcome everybody back to the fair this year.
The takeaway from your story that I got was there is a lot of passionate people who love creating this community of the Renaissance Fair. They love participating, being creative, and performing as part of it. And they also care a lot about it. But they are concerned about the direction the fair is taking and that something is being lost in the soul of this event. That includes historical accuracy, education, the soul of the volunteerism effort. They say that this is disappearing as the company makes changes. What do the volunteers say about what's being lost as a result?
When you think about the history of these fairs, they were founded by kind of these eccentric weirdos, people who didn't have a place to be themselves, and then they created one. The fair was founded on those foundations of community, of passion, of love, of eccentricity. And each year, with this turnover, with this loss of guilds, the fair loses some of that color, some of that texture. It's to me, it feels like a smoothing over, a commercialization. You pay more for less.
And who replaces the volunteers when they go away?
Either national acts, people who you could see in any fair, people who are not local from Washington, or you will get people who are not as skilled at a craft, people who the fair has found as last-minute replacements. And the word that I kept hearing in relationship to what's happening to the fair is theme parkification. Originally, this is a grassroots, community-built, community-run event. It for sure had its issues, but right now the Washington Midsummer Renaissance Faire seems to be moving in a direction of commercialization.
But this is a business, right? And I mean, so I'm just reading from part of the statement from RAES and WITP. So that's the nonprofit and the for-profit arm that run the Ren Fair. And they're saying, that businesses across Washington have seen production costs go up, and the Midsummer Renaissance Faire is no different. As a result, quote, we've had to make difficult decisions, including increasing ticket prices and being more selective, and a more selective vendor invitation process to ensure the fair's continued success. So, this is a business, basically. Like, can't they do what makes sense for their business?
They totally can if they're not a nonprofit and if they are paying their workers. I think that it's really the fact that they are doing more to get more money, expanding the weekends, removing the perks, raising ticket prices. But they're doing all of that, and the people whose backs this was built on are getting nothing. And not only that, but the experience is worse for them. So bad, in fact, that they're leaving in droves. And when I talked to these people, they communicated that things had never been perfect at the fair. There's always been these issues. And it takes a lot for somebody who's this passionate about this one thing to up and leave. They form families. They form communities. Like, this is their life. And they've had to abandon it because it's gotten so bad.
Natalie Graham is a reporter whose work can be found in The Stranger and in Seattle Met. Thank you very much, Natalie, for being here.
Thank you so much.
And Soundside reached out to both Reyes and Wandering in Time Productions for their response to Natalie's story. They declined an interview, but they did send us a statement that we'll share in our show notes. As for Vicky VanHout, our coworker who has tickets to this year's fair, she is still planning to go, but she says she may approach her visit with a new perspective.
What it's making me think most about is how I'm going to engage at the fair. Where are the local guilds that I've heard about? I need to go find these groups. I need to, ask them to teach me things and spend more time engaging in the perhaps less super impressive or famous, but just as much or even more so deserving of the attention, especially because they're local. So they understand this area so much better.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. By the way, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.